A flight attendant slaps a black boy mid-flight, convinced he doesn't belong in first class. She thinks she's just keeping order, until a powerful man in a navy suit slowly stands up. The entire plane falls silent as he utters a chilling sentence that changes everything. "You just put your hands on my son." What happens next is a reckoning no one on that flight will ever forget. How far will one man go to make sure justice is served? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Karen Whitmore's morning routine was as precise as the crisp lines of her perfectly pressed uniform. The fluorescent lights of the airport staff lounge cast a harsh glow as she stood by the coffee machine, methodically stirring 2 packets of sweetener into her cup. The familiar aroma of coffee filled her nostrils as she took small, careful sips, avoiding any drops that might stain her pristine blue blazer. She pulled out her phone, checking her schedule for the day. "Flight 482, New York to Los Angeles," she muttered to herself, her lips pursing into a thin line. After 23 years as a flight attendant, Karen took pride in running a tight ship, especially in first class. She considered it her personal domain, a space where she knew exactly who belonged and who didn't. Glancing at her reflection in the break room window, she adjusted her silver wings pin and smoothed back a stray blonde hair that had escaped her neat bun. Everything had to be perfect. That's what separated the professionals from the rest, she thought. "Morning, Karen," called out Sarah, a younger flight attendant, as she rushed past with her own coffee. Karen merely nodded, already focused on mentally reviewing her pre-flight checklist. First class required a special touch, the right balance of authority and service that she'd perfected over the years. She took one final sip of coffee, tossed the cup in the recycling bin, and headed toward Gate 23 with measured steps. The boarding process began right on schedule. Karen stood at her post near the first-class cabin, greeting passengers with what she considered her professional smile, pleasant but not too friendly. The usual parade of first-class travelers filed past her, a silver-haired CEO type in an Italian suit, tapping away on his phone. An elderly couple, the woman's neck adorned with a strand of pearls that caught the cabin lights. A group of college students with Greek letters on their sweatshirts, probably flying on daddy's miles, Karen thought with slight disapproval at their casual attire. Then she saw him. A young black boy no more than 10 years old walked confidently down the jet bridge. He wore pressed khakis, a navy blazer, and leather shoes that probably cost more than Karen's weekly salary. He carried a leather messenger bag across his shoulder, moving with the ease of someone who'd flown first class before. Karen's eyes narrowed as she watched him settle into seat 3C. No adult followed him. No parent or guardian appeared to claim the seat next to him. Instead, the boy, Jamal Brooks according to the manifest, pulled out a comic book and began reading, completely at ease in his surroundings. Something about this didn't sit right with Karen. She'd seen unaccompanied minors before, but they usually flew coach. First class? Her suspicion meter was rising by the second. "Excuse me," a voice called out, and Karen turned to see Mr. Davidson, a regular on this route, settling into his seat 2 rows ahead of the boy. She hurried over to help him stow his briefcase, watching from the corner of her eye as Jamal continued reading his comic book, completely absorbed in the colorful pages. Mr. Davidson pulled out his wallet, absently tucking it into the seat pocket in front of him as he arranged his laptop and other items. Karen noticed this detail with particular attention, her mind already connecting dots that existed only in her imagination. As the boarding continued, Karen found herself making more trips past row 3 than necessary. Each time, Jamal sat quietly, either reading his comic book or looking out the window at the ground crew preparing the aircraft. He said thank you when she performed the required seatbelt check, his voice clear and well-mannered, which somehow made Karen even more suspicious. The final passengers boarded and the cabin door was secured. Karen went through her safety demonstration with mechanical precision, though her attention kept drifting to the young boy sitting alone in first class. Something just wasn't right. She'd seen too many scams, too many people trying to game the system over the years. Her instincts were rarely wrong, she told herself. As the plane began to taxi, Karen made one final pass through the cabin. Mr. Davidson was now on his phone, probably sending last-minute emails before takeoff. The elderly couple had already reclined their seats slightly, holding hands as they waited for departure. The college students had quieted down, some already dozing off. Suddenly, Mr. Davidson sat up straight in his seat. His hand went to his back pocket, then to his jacket. His movements became more frantic as he bent forward, checking the seat pocket in front of him. Karen watched as his face transformed from confusion to alarm. "My wallet," he said, his voice rising with concern. "It's gone. I just had it right here." Karen's head snapped toward row 3 so fast she nearly gave herself whiplash. Jamal was still sitting there, comic book open on his lap, but now Karen was certain, absolutely certain, that she'd been right all along. Her heart began to race with the anticipation of catching someone in the act, of proving that her instincts about who belonged in first class had been correct. She stood in the aisle, her body rigid with purpose, her eyes locked onto the young boy who seemed far too calm for someone who must have just stolen a wallet. 23 years of experience told her this was the moment she'd been waiting for since she first saw him board the plane alone. The plane leveled out at cruising altitude, the gentle hum of engines settling into a steady rhythm. Soft afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of first class, creating patches of warmth across the plush seats. Karen moved with practiced efficiency through the cabin, her serving cart clicking softly against the carpet. Her uniform was crisp and perfect, just like she believed everything in her domain should be. "Would you care for a beverage, sir?" she asked, stopping at Mr. Davidson's row. The businessman barely looked up, his hands still patting his pockets with increasing desperation. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he lifted his seat cushion for the third time, his fingers frantically searching every crease and fold. "Sir?" Karen pressed, noting how his face had grown red with anxiety. "Is something wrong?" Her voice carried that professional concern that came from years of customer service, though impatience lurked just beneath the surface. Mr. Davidson looked up at her, his tie slightly askew from bending over to search under his seat. "My wallet," he said, voice tight with stress. "I've checked everywhere. It has my corporate cards, my ID, everything." He ran a hand through his graying hair, messing up its careful styling. "I know I had it when I boarded. I specifically remember putting it right here." He jabbed a finger at the empty seat pocket, his frustration evident in the sharpness of his movement. Karen leaned in close, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "I think I might know where it is." Her eyes darted meaningfully toward row 3, where Jamal sat absorbed in his comic book. The boy hadn't moved since takeoff, but to Karen this only made him look more suspicious. Her lips thinned into a tight line as she made her assumption without a shred of evidence. Mr. Davidson followed her gaze, his brow furrowing. "You don't think—" Karen straightened up, smoothing her skirt with sharp, decisive movements. "Leave it to me, sir." Her heels clicked purposefully as she marched down the aisle to Jamal's seat. She positioned herself to block his path to the aisle, her shadow falling across his comic book like a sudden storm cloud. Her presence loomed over him, intentionally intimidating. "Hand it over," she demanded, her voice clipped and cold, each word sharp as broken glass. Jamal looked up, confusion clear in his brown eyes. "What?" He glanced around, as if trying to understand what was happening. The comic book in his hands was still open to the same page he'd been reading for the last 20 minutes. "The wallet." Karen's fingers drummed against the armrest of the empty seat beside him. "Don't play dumb with me. We both know what you did." Her tone carried absolute certainty, as though his guilt was already established beyond question. The boy's confusion turned to fear as he realized what she was suggesting. He sat up straighter, his comic book forgotten in his lap. "I didn't take anything," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. There was dignity in his response that belied his young age. Other passengers were starting to take notice. The elderly couple across the aisle exchanged concerned glances. A businessman lowered his newspaper. The college students stopped their quiet chatter, all eyes turning toward the confrontation unfolding in row 3. The atmosphere in the cabin grew thick with tension. Karen's hand shot out, grabbing Jamal's wrist. Her fingers dug into his skin as she yanked his arm up. "I will not tolerate theft on my plane," she hissed through clenched teeth. "Give it back." Her grip tightened with each word, leaving white marks on his brown skin. Behind them, a woman in a red blazer raised her phone, its camera lens pointed directly at the scene. The soft murmur of concerned passengers grew louder, filling the cabin with tension thick enough to cut. Someone whispered, "Is she allowed to do that?" While another passenger shook his head in disbelief. "I swear," Jamal said, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to pull his wrist free. "I didn't take it." His eyes were wide now, darting around the cabin as if searching for help. Despite his fear, there was a remarkable composure in the way he held himself. Karen's grip tightened. She'd dealt with troublemakers before, but this boy's continued denials pushed her over the edge. 23 years of authority wouldn't be undermined by some kid who didn't belong in her first-class cabin. Her free hand rose, palm flat. The slap cracked through the air like a gunshot echoing in the confined space. Jamal's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow. For a moment, complete silence fell over the cabin. Then came the gasps, the shocked exclamations, the outraged voices rising in volume and anger. Someone in the back shouted, "That's assault!" while the phones recording the incident multiplied. Slowly, as if moving through water, Jamal raised his hand to his cheek. The skin was already turning red, a perfect imprint of Karen's hand forming on his young face. His eyes were wide with disbelief, glistening with unshed tears he refused to let fall. His dignity remained intact even as the mark on his face deepened. Then his gaze shifted, looking past Karen to someone several rows back. Karen followed his line of sight and felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. A man in an impeccably tailored Navy suit was rising from his seat. His movements were deliberate, controlled, like a panther uncoiling before a strike. His expression was carved from stone, but his eyes held something that made Karen take an involuntary step backward. It wasn't rage she saw there, but something far more terrifying. Absolute certainty. "Miss Whitmore," Darnell Brooks said, his quiet voice somehow carrying over the angry murmurs of the other passengers. Each word fell like a lead weight in the suddenly silent cabin. "You just put your hands on my son." The silence in the cabin was absolute, broken only by the steady hum of the engines. Every passenger sat frozen, phones raised, capturing the moment when Karen Whitmore's world began to crumble. Her heart hammered against her ribs so hard she thought it might burst through her chest. The pit in her stomach grew deeper with each step Darnell Brooks took toward her. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who never needed to rush, never needed to raise his voice to command attention. His expensive suit couldn't quite hide the steel in his frame, and his carefully neutral expression did nothing to mask the cold fury in his eyes. Karen took another stumbling step backward, her heel catching on the carpet. She grabbed the nearest seat to steady herself, her knuckles white against the leather. The red mark on Jamal's cheek seemed to glow accusingly in the cabin's lighting. "Sir, Her voice cracked, the words dying in her throat as Darnell Brooks came to stand before her. He towered over her, and despite the perfect cut of his suit and his polished appearance, there was something almost predatory in his stance. More phones appeared, their camera lenses glinting like judging eyes. The elderly couple who had been watching earlier shook their heads in disgust. The college students whispered furiously among themselves, their phones steady on the unfolding scene. "I was just doing my job," Karen managed to squeak out, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "There was a theft reported, and My wallet!" The shout cut through the tension like a knife. Everyone turned to see Mr. Davidson, the businessman who had reported the missing wallet, frantically untangling something from his seatbelt. His face had turned from anxious to mortified as he held up the leather billfold that had somehow gotten wedged in the mechanism. The cabin erupted. "She hit that kid for nothing," someone shouted from the back. "Did you see how she grabbed him? I got it all on video." That poor boy. Karen's head spun as the accusations flew. The cabin seemed to tilt and swim before her eyes, the faces of the passengers blurring into a sea of judgment and outrage. She tried to speak, to explain, to justify. But what could she say? The evidence of her actions was right there on Jamal's face, captured on dozens of phones, witnessed by a cabin full of horrified passengers. I assumed. The words felt like ashes in her mouth. Darnell Brooks hadn't moved, hadn't changed his expression. He simply watched her, his gaze as sharp as a scalpel, dissecting her weak attempts at explanation. Then, without a word to her, he turned toward the cockpit. "Divert the plane back to New York," he said, his voice carrying clearly despite its measured tone. The pilot, who had come out to investigate the commotion, blinked in surprise. "Sir?" I said, "Turn this plane around. Right now." There was no anger in Darnell's voice, no raised volume, but the authority in his tone was unmistakable. "I'm Darnell Brooks, CEO of Atlantic Airways, and I'm ordering you to return to JFK immediately." The cabin exploded into chaos. Several passengers burst into applause. Others gasped at the revelation of who exactly had witnessed Karen's actions. A few pulled out their phones to Google his name, their eyes widening as they confirmed his identity. "Yes, sir," the pilot said quickly, already turning back to the cockpit. "Right away, Mr. Brooks." Karen's legs gave out and she collapsed into an empty seat. Her hands shook as she gripped her serving tray, using it like a shield against the accusing stares of the passengers. The plane began to bank left, and her stomach lurched with the motion. Sarah, another flight attendant, leaned close to her ear. "You just lost your entire career, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice a mixture of pity and satisfaction. "And not just with this airline." The reality of what she'd done crashed over Karen like a tidal wave. 23 years of service, gone in an instant. Her pension, her benefits, her identity, all destroyed by one moment of unthinking prejudice. She'd assaulted a child, the son of the CEO, in front of a plane full of witnesses with cameras. The serving tray rattled in her trembling hands as the plane continued its turn back toward New York. Jamal had moved to sit beside his father, who had one protective arm around his shoulders. The boy's cheek still bore the red imprint of her hand, a damning testament to her actions that no explanation could erase. Through her haze of panic, Karen heard the pilot's voice come over the intercom, announcing their return to JFK due to an onboard incident. The passengers continued recording, their phones trained on her like weapons, ensuring that her moment of shame would live forever on social media. She wanted to disappear, to sink through the floor of the plane, to wake up and find this was all a terrible dream. But the cold reality remained. She had revealed her true self to the world, and now she would face the consequences. The intercom crackled to life, but it wasn't the pilot's voice that filled the cabin this time. Darnell Brooks stood at the front of first class, his posture relaxed but commanding as he held the handset. The entire cabin fell silent, all eyes fixed on him, phones still recording, capturing what was clearly about to be a moment of significance. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Darnell Brooks." His voice carried through the speakers with crystal clarity, each word measured and precise. "I am the CEO of this airline." The statement hung in the air, simple yet powerful, requiring no embellishment. Karen's fingers dug into the armrests of her seat. The calm in his voice was terrifying, like the eye of a hurricane, promising devastation to follow. She felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead as she realized who exactly she had been dealing with. "Today, a racist assault took place on my son," Darnell continued, his words falling like hammer blows in the hushed cabin. "And I want you all to know that discrimination has no place in my company." His voice never rose, yet it seemed to fill every corner of the aircraft with authority. He paused, his gaze sweeping across the cabin before landing directly on Karen. Their eyes locked, and in that moment, she knew her fate was sealed. Effective immediately, Karen Whitmore is no longer employed by this airline. The cabin erupted in applause and cheers. Several passengers stood up, clapping enthusiastically. Some whistled their approval. Karen felt the blood drain from her face, her stomach plummeting as if the plane had suddenly dropped 30,000 feet. The world seemed to tilt sideways and she gripped the armrests harder, trying to anchor herself to something solid as everything else spun out of control. 23 years, gone in seconds, just like that. The applause continued, washing over her like waves of judgment. She looked around the cabin, desperate for even one sympathetic face but found none. Some passengers were laughing, their phones still raised high, capturing her humiliation for posterity. Others simply watched with quiet satisfaction, as if witnessing long-awaited justice being served. A few nodded in solemn agreement with Darnell's decision. The woman in row 5, the one who had started recording the moment Karen had confronted Jamal, nodded approvingly at Darnell. Her phone was still steady, documenting every second of Karen's downfall. Near the back of first class, a black woman dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, murmuring, "Finally," in a voice thick with emotion. An elderly gentleman gave Darnell a respectful nod as if to say, "Well done." Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. What could she possibly say? That she was just doing her job? That she had made an honest mistake? The red mark on Jamal's cheek said otherwise. The missing wallet had been found in its owner's seat. There was no theft, no threat, no justification, just her own prejudice, now exposed for all to see. Sarah, her former colleague, approached with a tight smile. "Ms. Whitmore, I need you to move to seat 32F in economy. Company policy states that terminated employees cannot remain in first class." There was a hint of satisfaction in Sarah's voice, revealing tensions that had likely been simmering beneath the surface for years. More snickers from the passengers. Someone muttered, "How the mighty have fallen." Another voice added, "Karma's real." Karen's cheeks burned as she stood on shaky legs, gathering her small carry-on bag. The walk of shame to the back of the plane felt endless, each step accompanied by whispers and the unmistakable sound of camera shutters. The aisle seemed to stretch on forever, a gauntlet of judgment she had to walk. Seat 32F was a middle seat in the last row right next to the lavatory. Karen sank into it, her crisp uniform now feeling like a costume, a reminder of everything she'd just lost. The irony wasn't lost on her. How many passengers had she relegated to these uncomfortable seats with a dismissive wave of her hand? From this vantage point, she could see the entire cabin, including where Jamal now sat beside his father. Darnell had one arm protectively around his son's shoulders as he spoke quietly to him. Jamal nodded at whatever his father was saying, his composure remarkable for a child who had just been assaulted by a stranger. The red mark on his cheek was fading, but Karen knew the video of what she'd done would last forever. It would follow her, haunt her job applications, pop up in searches of her name. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She stared at them, these hands that had just destroyed everything she'd built over 2 decades. Her career, her authority, her identity as a respected senior flight attendant. All gone in one moment of unthinking prejudice. The pension she'd been counting on, the benefits she'd earned, the reputation she'd built, stripped away as easily as her wings pin. The golden wings she'd worn with such pride now felt like they were burning a hole in her pocket. The plane continued its course back to New York, the engines humming steadily. Each minute felt like an hour as Karen sat there, a passenger on a flight she was supposed to be running. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, hear the murmurs and whispers, catch glimpses of phones still recording her disgrace. A child peeked over the seat in front of her, staring with unabashed curiosity before being pulled back by a parent. Up in first class, Jamal remained untouchable beside his father, safe in the protection of real power, not the illusion of authority she had wielded so carelessly. Karen watched as a flight attendant served them drinks, treating them with the respect she should have shown from the start. The attendant's smile was genuine, her service impeccable, everything Karen should have been. Her world had crumbled so quickly, like a sandcastle swept away by the tide. There would be no coming back from this, no explanation that could save her career, no apology that could undo what she'd done. As the plane carried her back to New York, Karen Whitmore sat alone, watching the pieces of her life scatter like ashes in the wind, carried away by the consequences of her own actions. The plane's wheels touched down on the JFK International Airport runway with a gentle thud. Karen sat rigid in her middle seat, her fingernails digging half-moons into her palms. The aircraft's engines whined as it slowed, turning onto the taxiway with mechanical precision. From her spot near the back of the plane, she could see almost every passenger, and they could all see her. Whispers continued to ripple through the cabin like waves. Some weren't even trying to be quiet anymore. Can you believe she actually hit that kid? I got the whole thing on video. My sister's gonna flip when she sees this. Racist flight attendant gets what's coming to her. Karen's throat felt tight, her uniform collar suddenly too constricting. She tried to take deep breaths to calm the trembling in her hands. There had to be a way to fix this. She'd explained that she was just doing her job, that she had reasonable suspicion. She'd worked in aviation for over 2 decades. Surely that counted for something. The plane continued its slow journey to the gate, each turn bringing her closer to whatever awaited her. Karen's mind raced through possible scenarios, desperate for a solution. Maybe if she apologized profusely, offered to take sensitivity training. She'd seen other flight attendants make mistakes before and they'd kept their jobs. This couldn't really be the end, could it? A young woman 2 rows ahead was still filming her, not even pretending to be subtle about it. The phone's camera lens felt like a spotlight, exposing every bead of sweat on Karen's forehead, every tremor in her hands. The aircraft came to a complete stop at the gate. The seatbelt sign remained illuminated as the ground crew connected the jet bridge. Karen's heart hammered against her ribs. She watched as her former colleagues began their usual post-flight procedures, preparing for passenger deplaning. They wouldn't look at her. The familiar chime of the seatbelt sign turning off seemed louder than usual. Before anyone could stand, the main cabin door opened. Karen's breath caught in her throat as 2 airport security officers stepped onto the plane, their uniforms crisp, their expressions stern. The sick feeling in her stomach intensified as they made their way down the aisle. Passengers shifted in their seats to watch, phones raised high. Some weren't even trying to hide their satisfied smiles. The officers stopped at her row. "Karen Whitmore," the taller one said, his voice firm but professional. "Please come with us." A cheer erupted from somewhere in the middle of the cabin. More phones appeared, recording her humiliation from every angle. Someone near the front called out, "Racist flight attendant gets what she deserves." Karen's legs felt disconnected from her body as she stood. Her knees threatened to buckle, and she had to grip the seat in front of her to steady herself. The overhead bins seemed to be closing in, the aisle narrowing. Every face she could see was turned toward her, watching her downfall with varying degrees of satisfaction and contempt. One last thread of hope flickered in her mind. Maybe this was just procedure. Maybe they just needed to question her about what happened. After all, she hadn't really hurt the boy. It was barely a tap. And Darnell Brooks, despite his power and influence, surely wouldn't want the hassle of pressing charges. Would he? The officers waited patiently as she gathered her small carry-on bag with trembling hands. Her wing's pin caught the overhead light, glinting mockingly. 23 years of service reduced to this moment. "This way, ma'am," the second officer said, gesturing toward the front of the plane. Karen stepped into the aisle. The walk felt endless. Every footstep echoed in her ears as she passed row after row of judgmental faces. Some passengers openly smirked. Others shook their heads in disgust. A few simply stared, their expressions hard and unforgiving. Near the front of first class, Darnell Brooks stood in the aisle, his presence commanding even in silence. Jamal was beside him, his young face composed and unreadable. As Karen approached, their eyes met. The boy said nothing. He didn't need to. His steady gaze held more power than any words could convey. Karen felt the weight of everything she'd done, every assumption she'd made, every prejudice she'd acted on reflected in those young eyes. She looked away first. The realization hit her like a physical blow. For the first time in her life, she was truly powerless. No uniform to hide behind, no authority to wield, no excuses that could save her. She was just Karen Whitmore, exposed for exactly who she was. Darnell and Jamal exited the plane first, their departure marked by respectful nods from the crew and supportive murmurs from the passengers. Karen followed behind them, flanked by the security officers, her head bowed, her shoulders slumped. She could hear the clicks of phone cameras following her all the way to the door, documenting every step of her walk of shame. The final moments of her aviation career captured forever, ready to be shared with the world. The morning had started so normally: coffee in the crew lounge, her usual uniform inspection, standard pre-flight checks. Now, as she stepped onto the jet bridge, Karen realized she would never perform any of those routines again. Her world had shrunk to this moment, this escort off the plane, this very public fall from grace, and there was absolutely nothing she could do about it. The security office was small and sterile, with harsh fluorescent lighting that made Karen's head pound. She sat in an uncomfortable metal chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. The room smelled of industrial cleaner and stale coffee. Officer Martinez sat across from her, his expression neutral as he reviewed some paperwork. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft whir of the air conditioning and the occasional shuffle of papers. "Ms. Whitmore," he finally said, looking up from his notes, "would you like to make a statement about what happened on Flight 482? Karen's mouth felt dry. Her mind raced through the events of the past few hours, trying to find the right words to explain herself. How could she make them understand? She'd been so sure, so convinced. She started, then stopped. The image of Jamal's shocked face after she'd slapped him flashed through her mind. The sound of that slap still echoed in her ears. Outside the small office, life at JFK continued its usual chaotic dance. But for Karen, everything had ground to a halt. Her phone, which sat on the metal table between them, wouldn't stop buzzing. She could see the notifications piling up one after another like accusations. Officer Martinez waited patiently, his pen poised over his notepad. "Take your time," he said, though his tone suggested he had plenty of other things to do. Meanwhile, across the city and beyond, the incident was spreading like wildfire. In coffee shops, offices, and homes, people huddled around phones and computers, watching the viral video of a flight attendant slapping a young black boy in first class. The footage was crystal clear, captured from multiple angles by passengers who'd sensed trouble brewing. Karen's face, contorted with misplaced certainty, filled screens across the country. The moment of impact played over and over, each viewing adding fuel to the growing outrage. News stations jumped on the story. Local anchors broke into regular programming with breaking news alerts. National networks picked it up within hours. The headlines wrote themselves. Flight attendant fired midair for assaulting CEO's black son. Karen Whitmore, a racist's career ends at 30,000 feet. Justice in the skies. Viral video shows airline CEO delivering swift consequences. Social media exploded. Twitter threads dissected every moment of the video. Instagram stories shared clips with angry captions. Facebook groups debated airline policies and systemic racism. Karen's name began trending, becoming a hashtag that represented everything wrong with unchecked privilege and prejudice. Her phone continued its relentless buzzing on the table. Text messages flooded in. "Karen, what were you thinking?" From her sister. "I can't believe you would do this," and from a former colleague. "Have you lost your mind?" From her best friend. "We need to talk about your position with the Airline Alumni Association." From the board president. Some messages expressed shock, others fury. A few longtime friends sent carefully worded messages distancing themselves from her actions. Former co-workers she'd known for years suddenly couldn't recall their associations fast enough. The airline's official social media accounts posted a statement. "We confirm the immediate termination of flight attendant Karen Whitmore following an incident of racial discrimination and physical assault aboard Flight 482. This behavior does not reflect our values. We have zero tolerance for racism and are committed to creating a safe, inclusive environment for all passengers." The statement was shared thousands of times within minutes. Comment sections filled with people applauding the swift action, sharing their own stories of discrimination in the air, and calling for broader changes in the industry. Back in the security office, Karen's phone buzzed again. She glanced down to see a news alert with her own name in the headline. Officer Martinez noticed her distraction. "Ms. Whitmore, about that statement?" Karen swallowed hard. What could she possibly say? Every explanation she'd constructed in her mind now seemed hollow. Every justification paper-thin. The evidence was there for the world to see, playing on repeat across millions of screens. After what felt like hours but was probably only 45 minutes, Karen was cleared to leave. No charges were filed. The airline and Darnell Brooks had chosen not to pursue legal action, perhaps knowing that public shame would be punishment enough. As she stepped out of the security office, Karen was immediately confronted by a wall of reporters. Camera lights flashed in her face. Microphones thrust toward her like accusing fingers. "Ms. Whitmore, what made you target a 10-year-old boy? Do you have a history of racial profiling? How does it feel to become the latest viral Karen?" She pushed through the crowd, keeping her head down, clutching her purse like a shield. Her legs felt weak, her steps uncertain. The exit seemed miles away. Finally, she burst through the automatic doors into the humid New York afternoon. The sun was too bright, the air too thick. She gulped in deep breaths, trying to steady herself. That's when she saw it. Above the airport terminal, a massive digital billboard dominated the skyline. And there, playing in high definition for all to see, was the video. Her video. Karen watched, transfixed in horror, as her larger-than-life self loomed over the airport entrance. Her face twisted with anger, her hand raised, the moment of impact frozen in time, before repeating again, and again, and again. The nausea hit her like a wave. She turned away, but the damage was done. The image was burned into her mind, her own face, contorted with prejudice and rage, immortalized on a screen the size of a building. Her legs nearly gave out. She stumbled to a nearby concrete barrier and sat down heavily, her world spinning. There was no escaping this, no explaining it away, no hiding from what she'd done. The billboard continued its endless loop above her, broadcasting her shame to everyone entering or leaving JFK International Airport. Her phone buzzed again in her purse, but she couldn't bear to look at it. The sound of car horns and airplane engines seemed distant, muffled by the roaring in her ears. The next day, Karen's eyes fluttered open to the harsh morning light streaming through her bedroom window. For a brief, blessed moment, she forgot everything. Then reality crashed back like a tidal wave, washing away the momentary peace with brutal clarity. Her phone lay on the nightstand, screen dark and menacing. She stared at it for nearly 20 minutes, heart pounding, before she finally worked up the courage to check it. The notifications made her head spin. Hundreds of missed calls, thousands of social media mentions, text messages, emails, voicemails, each one a tiny dagger of consequence. One voicemail in particular made her stomach drop. Her landlord's gruff voice filled her ear. "Ms. Whitmore, we need to talk about your lease. Call me back immediately." The coldness in his tone left little doubt about the conversation to come. Karen's hands trembled as she scrolled through her email. 10 job applications she'd sent out yesterday had already been rejected. The responses were polite but firm, each one another door slamming in her face. "Thank you for your interest, but we've decided to pursue other candidates. Unfortunately, your application does not meet our current needs. We are unable to move forward with your application at this time." She opened her laptop, dreading what she'd find. Sure enough, her name was still trending. News articles dissected every moment of the incident, analyzing her expressions, her tone, her body language. Opinion pieces analyzed her actions, using words like entitlement and systemic racism. Social media continued its relentless commentary, with strangers debating her character as if they'd known her all her life. The week that followed was a blur of rejection and isolation. Every major airline had blacklisted her. She'd tried applying to smaller, private airlines, thinking they might be more forgiving or perhaps hadn't heard the news, but her name was toxic in the industry. Even travel agencies wouldn't consider her resume, politely ending phone calls the moment she introduced herself. Her phone rang less and less as friends slowly disappeared from her life. Text messages went unanswered. Lunch invitations were canceled with flimsy excuses. Social media connections quietly unfriended her, one by one, like rats abandoning a sinking ship. The final blow came from her own sister, Sarah. They met at a small coffee shop far from Sarah's school, where she taught 4th grade. Sarah wouldn't even look Karen in the eye as she stirred her untouched latte, her wedding ring clinking nervously against the ceramic mug. "You really messed up, Karen," Sarah said, her voice tight with disappointment. "I can't have my students seeing me associated with you. Do you understand what this would do to my career, to my reputation? The parents are already asking questions. Karen stared at her sister, feeling the last thread of her support system unraveling before her eyes. "Sarah, please. You're my sister. We've been through everything together. And you're all over the news for hitting a child because of his race." Sarah stood up, leaving her coffee untouched, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I'm sorry, Karen. I just can't. Not right now. Maybe someday, but not now." The days blurred together in a haze of desperation. Karen's carefully built life crumbled piece by piece, like a sandcastle at high tide. Her bank account dwindled alarmingly fast. New York rent wasn't forgiving, and her savings were disappearing on essentials she'd always taken for granted. She applied everywhere she could think of, places she would have sneered at just weeks before: customer service positions, receptionist jobs, retail stores, department stores, even fast food restaurants. The rejections came faster now, sometimes within hours of applying, as if her applications were being automatically filtered out. Her landlord's final notice arrived on a Tuesday morning. The paper was crisp and official, giving her 2 weeks to vacate her apartment. Karen read it 3 times, the words swimming before her eyes as tears threatened to fall. That same afternoon, the repo men came for her car. She watched from her apartment window as they hooked it up to the tow truck, efficient and impersonal. The silver sedan she'd bought brand new 2 years ago, gone in minutes along with the monthly payments she could no longer afford. The apartment emptied gradually as she sold what she could through online marketplaces. Her designer clothes went first, though for far less than she'd paid. The furniture followed, piece by piece, until only the basics remained: a mattress on the floor, a single chair, a small table. One night, Karen sat cross-legged on the bare floor of her living room. The space echoed with emptiness, the walls seeming farther away without her tasteful decorations. Her TV screen was black, reflecting her image back at her like a dark mirror. In the reflection, she barely recognized herself. Her perfect flight attendant posture was gone, replaced by slumped shoulders and a curved spine. Her immaculate makeup was absent, leaving dark circles under her eyes exposed. Her carefully styled hair hung limp and unwashed, graying at the roots without her regular salon appointments. As she stared at her reflection, her mind drifted to Jamal, that poised, well-dressed boy who'd done nothing wrong except exist in a space she'd decided he didn't belong in. Her lip curled slightly, a reflexive gesture of resentment. If he hadn't been there, she thought bitterly, if he hadn't been sitting in first class looking so out of place, if his father hadn't been the CEO, if. The thoughts circled in her head like vultures picking at the carcass of her former life. She refused to acknowledge the real source of her downfall. It was easier to blame Jamal, to make him the villain in her story. Even now, with everything stripped away, she couldn't or wouldn't face the truth that stared back at her from that dark screen. Her phone buzzed weakly beside her. The battery was dying, just like everything else in her life. Another rejection email. She didn't bother reading it, already knowing what it would say. The black screen of the TV continued to reflect her image, a ghost of her former self sitting in an empty apartment, clinging to her prejudices because they were all she had left, the last familiar things in a world that had moved on without her. Days later, Karen stood in front of Rachel's modest 2-story house, clutching her single suitcase. The morning sun felt harsh on her face as she waited for her sister to answer the door. This was it, her last resort after everything else had crumbled away. Rachel opened the door, her expression carefully neutral. She wore casual clothes, so different from Karen's still pristine business attire. "Come in," she said simply, stepping aside. The house smelled like coffee and cinnamon, warm, inviting scents that made Karen's throat tight. She followed Rachel through the living room, taking in the family photos on the walls, the stack of papers on the coffee table marked with red pen, Rachel's student assignments. "The guest room is upstairs," Rachel said, leading the way. "It's small, but it's clean." She pushed open a door to reveal a sparse but neat room with a twin bed, dresser, and small desk. Karen set her suitcase down, trying to maintain her dignity. "Thank you," she said stiffly. Rachel crossed her arms, leaning against the doorframe. "Let's be clear about something. she said, her voice firm. "You can stay here. I won't let my sister be homeless, but there's one condition." Karen turned to face her sister, jaw clenched. "You don't bring your mess into my house," Rachel continued. "You need to own what you did. No victim act, no blame shifting, no racist comments. Not here." Karen scoffed but nodded quickly when she saw Rachel's expression harden. What choice did she have? Her bank account was empty, her reputation was destroyed, and her options had run out. "I mean it, Karen," Rachel pressed. "One slip-up, one racist comment, one attempt to justify what you did, and you're out. I work with children of all backgrounds. I can't have your toxicity in my home." "Fine," Karen muttered. "I understand." The days that followed showed Karen just how far she had fallen. A trip to the local grocery store turned into a nightmare when a woman in the produce section pointed at her, nudging her friend. "That's her," the woman stage whispered. "That's the racist flight attendant who hit that little boy." Karen abandoned her shopping cart, hurrying out of the store with her cheeks burning. She tried a different store the next day, but the whispers followed her there too. At a coffee shop downtown, Karen stood in line, keeping her head down. When she reached the counter, the young barista's friendly smile vanished. "Oh," he said, his voice cold. "I know you." "I'd like a medium coffee," Karen said quietly. The barista shook his head. "Sorry. We reserve the right to refuse service." He gestured to a sign on the wall. "And we don't serve racists here." Other customers started turning, watching. Some pulled out their phones. Karen fled before they could start recording. Her world shrank day by day. She deleted her social media accounts after the 100th death threat. Her email inbox filled with hate mail faster than she could delete it. Eventually, she changed her email address altogether. Rachel watched all this with a mix of sympathy and frustration. "You could try apologizing," she suggested one evening. "A real apology, not excuses." But Karen couldn't bring herself to do it. The words stuck in her throat every time she tried. One night, sitting at the small desk in the guest room, Karen scrolled through job listings on her laptop. Her eyes were burning from hours of searching. Every application felt like throwing a message in a bottle into an ocean of rejection. A news article caught her eye. The headline made her stomach clench. Jamal Brooks, youngest speaker at Civil Rights Conference, gives powerful speech on systemic racism in travel industry. Against her better judgment, she clicked. A photo loaded at the top of the article. Jamal and Darnell Brooks, both in sharp suits, standing at a podium. They were smiling, confident, powerful. The article praised Jamal's remarkable poise and inspiring message of change. Karen slammed the laptop shut so hard the desk shook. That night, she lay in the narrow guest bed staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. The moonlight cast strange shadows on the walls. Her mind kept returning to that photo. Jamal and his father, thriving, making a difference, turning her worst moment into a catalyst for positive change. Meanwhile, she was here, sleeping in her sister's guest room, unable to get even the most basic job, running from pointing fingers and whispered accusations. Jamal was soaring, speaking at conferences, probably flying first class whenever he wanted, and she was trapped on the ground, weighed down by her own actions. For the first time since that day on the plane, a different kind of thought crept into her mind. Not anger at Jamal, not resentment at Darnell Brooks, not self-pity about her situation. Instead, a quiet, uncomfortable realization began to take shape. Maybe she really did ruin her own life. The thought sat heavy in her chest as she continued to stare at the ceiling. Her own actions, her own choices, her own prejudices. They had brought her here. Not Jamal, not his father. Not the viral videos or social media outrage, just her. Karen sat at Rachel's dining table, her fingers hovering over the laptop keyboard. The screen glowed with another batch of rejection emails. 50 of them. Each one a fresh reminder of her fall from grace. She clicked through them mechanically, her jaw tightening with each automated response. "Thank you for your interest, but..." Rachel stood in the kitchen doorway, watching her sister with a mix of concern and frustration. She held a steaming mug of tea, the aromatic blend doing nothing to soften the tension in the room. The morning light filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the wooden table where Karen had spent countless hours searching for work. "Karen," Rachel said, her voice gentle but firm, "have you even tried applying outside of airlines?" Karen's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with indignation. The familiar defensive anger rose in her chest, hot and immediate. "I was a senior flight attendant for 15 years, she snapped, her voice rising. 15 years of experience, training, certifications? You expect me to work in retail?" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with pride and desperation. Rachel's expression hardened, her patience visibly wearing thin. She set her mug down on the counter with a sharp click. "No, Karen," she replied, each word measured and deliberate. "I expect you to work anywhere that will take you." The truth of those words hit Karen like a physical blow. She turned back to her laptop, shoulders hunched, trying to hide how much the statement stung. But Rachel was right. She had no choice. Her savings were depleted and she couldn't live off her sister's charity forever. With trembling fingers, Karen opened a new browser tab. She forced herself to type entry-level jobs into the search bar, each keystroke feeling like a surrender. The results populated her screen, positions she would have sneered at just months ago. She started with what seemed least humiliating: hotel receptionist. Her customer service skills would transfer well, she thought. She spent an hour crafting the perfect cover letter, emphasizing her experience in hospitality while carefully avoiding mention of the incident that ended her career. Rejected within minutes. The hotel chain's HR department recognized her name. She tried for a customer service representative position at a call center. Surely they wouldn't care about her past. She wouldn't even be facing customers in person. She submitted her application with slightly more confidence. Rejected again. The email was polite but clear. "We maintain a strict zero-tolerance policy regarding discrimination." Getting desperate, she applied to be a supermarket cashier. The pay was barely above minimum wage, but at this point, she'd take anything. She even tried using her middle name instead of Karen on the application. The rejection came through her phone while she was making dinner. They'd recognized her face from the viral video. Karen paced Rachel's kitchen, her phone clutched so tightly her knuckles turned white. The screen continued to light up with rejection after rejection. Each ping felt like another nail in the coffin of her former life. Her feet wore a path between the refrigerator and the sink as she moved restlessly, unable to stay still. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the growing darkness, marking time as her options dwindled further. She refreshed the job search page for the 100th time that day. A new listing caught her eye, and her finger froze mid-scroll. "Airport custodial staff hiring immediately." Karen stared at the posting, her stomach churning. The description was straightforward: maintaining cleanliness in airport terminals, restrooms, and common areas. Night shift available. Benefits included. No experience necessary. A janitor. At an airport. Her entire body recoiled at the thought. She would be cleaning floors in the same terminals where she once strode confidently in her crisp uniform, emptying trash cans where she used to direct first-class passengers, scrubbing bathrooms while her former colleagues walked past in their perfectly pressed clothes. The humiliation would be unbearable. Every person who recognized her would see how far she'd fallen. Every former co-worker would whisper and point. She imagined herself in the dull gray uniform of the cleaning staff, pushing a cart past the flight crews she used to lead. But the alternative was worse. Rachel's spare room wasn't a permanent solution. The rejections wouldn't stop coming. Her situation wouldn't magically improve. Karen's hand shook as she moved the cursor to the Apply Now button. Her finger hovered over the trackpad, unwilling to click. Pride warred with necessity in her mind as she stared at the screen. Finally, with a trembling hand, she submitted the application. Each required field she filled out felt like another piece of her former self crumbling away. When she hit the final Submit button, she felt physically ill. She hated herself for it. Hated that she had been reduced to this. Hated that she had no other choice. But most of all, she hated that small voice in the back of her mind that whispered she deserved it. That night, Karen's phone buzzed on the nightstand, jolting her from an uneasy sleep. She'd been having the same dream again, standing in her flight attendant uniform, watching helplessly as it dissolved into ash. Rolling over in Rachel's guest bed, she grabbed her phone and squinted at the bright screen. New email. Her heart skipped when she saw the sender. JFK Airport Human Resources. Congratulations! You've been hired as a custodial worker at JFK Airport. Please report to the maintenance department office at 6 a.m. tomorrow morning for orientation and training. Karen's stomach lurched. She sat up slowly, the phone trembling in her hand as she read the email again and again. Each word seemed to mock her, a stark reminder of how far she had fallen. The bed creaked as she swung her legs over the side, sitting there in the dim morning light. Her sister's house was quiet. Rachel had already left for school. Karen was glad. She couldn't bear to see the mixture of pity and satisfaction that would cross Rachel's face at this news. She walked to the bathroom on unsteady legs, bracing herself against the counter as she stared at her reflection. The woman looking back at her seemed older somehow, worn down by months of rejection and shame. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her once perfectly maintained hair hung limp around her face. "You can do this," she whispered to her reflection, but the words rang hollow. The next morning came too quickly. Karen stood in front of her closet, looking at the row of expensive clothes she'd accumulated during her years as a senior flight attendant. Designer blazers, silk blouses, tailored pants, none of them appropriate for her new position. In the back, she found what she was looking for: plain black pants and a simple white shirt, the kind she would have never worn to work before. The drive to JFK felt surreal. She'd made this journey thousands of times, but never like this. Never in a borrowed car, Rachel's old Honda, never wearing clothes from Target, never to report to the maintenance department. As she approached the familiar terminals, her hands tightened on the steering wheel. The maintenance office was in a utilitarian building behind Terminal B, far from the glossy public areas where she used to work. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she approached the front desk. The woman there barely looked up as Karen gave her name. "Through that door," she pointed. "Mr. Martinez is waiting." Mr. Martinez turned out to be a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude. He didn't seem to recognize her, or if he did, he didn't show it. He handed her a gray uniform with JFK Maintenance embroidered on the chest. "Bathrooms down the hall," he said. "Change and come back for your assignment." The uniform was scratchy and slightly too big. Karen changed quickly, avoiding the mirror above the sink. When she returned, Mr. Martinez was waiting with a large cleaning cart stocked with supplies: mops, buckets, cleaning solutions, trash bags. "Terminal B is your assignment," he said, demonstrating how to maneuver the cart. "Focus on the main corridors and gate areas. Bathrooms every 2 hours. Report any maintenance issues immediately." Karen nodded mechanically, trying to process the instructions through the fog of humiliation clouding her mind. "Any questions?" Mr. Martinez asked. She shook her head. "All right then, get to work." Pushing the cart through the service entrance into Terminal B, Karen felt exposed, vulnerable. The bright terminal light seemed harsh and accusing. Early morning travelers rushed past, pulling their rolling suitcases, clutching their coffee cups. None of them looked at her. She was invisible. A group of flight attendants walked by, their heels clicking on the polished floor. Karen recognized the uniform, her old uniform. She quickly turned away, pretending to adjust something on her cart. Their perfume lingered in the air, expensive and familiar. She used to wear the same brand. Business travelers in expensive suits strode past, talking importantly into their phones. First-class passengers rolled their designer luggage toward their gates. These were the people she used to interact with, the ones whose drinks she used to serve, whose complaints she used to handle with professional authority. Now she was nothing to them, less than nothing. Just another faceless worker in a gray uniform, pushing a cart full of cleaning supplies. Her face burned as she began mopping the floor near the windows, the same windows where she used to stand, watching planes take off and land, feeling like she owned a piece of the sky. Now she could only see her reflection in the glass, bent over a mop, anonymous in her oversized uniform. The morning crawled by. Karen worked methodically, keeping her head down, trying to be as invisible as everyone seemed to think she was. She cleaned spilled coffee, picked up discarded newspapers, wiped down seats. Each task felt like another small death of her former self. Near gate 24, she was scrubbing at a stubborn scuff mark on the floor when she heard it. Familiar laughter. The kind of laughter she used to share in the crew lounge during breaks between flights. Her shoulders tensed as the voices grew closer. "Did you hear about that flight to LA next week?" one voice said. "They're short-staffed since—" The voice trailed off. Karen could feel eyes on her back. "Oh my God," another voice whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Is that Karen Whitmore?" Karen's hands tightened around the mop handle until her knuckles turned white. She kept her eyes fixed on the floor, but she could hear the whispers growing, could feel more people stopping to stare. "It is her. I can't believe it. Karma's really something, isn't it?" Karen continued mopping the same spot, her movements mechanical, her face burning with shame. She didn't look up. She couldn't. But she knew they were all staring at her. Her former colleagues, maybe even people she had trained or worked with. Now they were watching her clean floors in a baggy gray uniform, pushing a cart full of cleaning supplies. The whispers and stares felt like physical blows, each one chipping away at what remained of her dignity. But she kept mopping, kept her head down, because what else could she do? This was her life now. This was what she had brought upon herself. Karen sat alone in the employee lounge, the harsh fluorescent lights making the space feel even more depressing than usual. Her microwaved sandwich sat half-eaten on a paper towel, the bread slightly soggy. The room smelled of stale coffee and cleaning supplies, a far cry from the premium lounges she used to frequent. Other employees occupied the scattered tables, but none sat near her. They knew who she was. Everyone knew. The isolation had become her new normal, but it still stung. The TV mounted in the corner droned on, providing background noise that Karen tried to ignore. She focused on her sandwich, picking at the wilted lettuce that poked out from between the bread slices. Her 30-minute break felt both too long and too short, a reminder of her new reality, but also a brief respite from the physical labor that left her body aching. The news anchor's voice suddenly cut through her thoughts. Coming up next, an exclusive interview with Jamal Brooks and his father, airline CEO Darnell Brooks. Karen's head snapped up, her sandwich forgotten. Her stomach twisted into a tight knot as the screen showed a preview clip. Jamal and Darnell sitting in studio chairs, both looking polished and confident. The boy was wearing a sharp blazer that probably cost more than Karen's monthly salary now. His smile was bright, genuine. The other employees in the break room stirred, their attention drawn to the TV. Someone turned up the volume. "Don't," Karen wanted to say, but she had no right to make demands anymore. She had no authority here, no power. She couldn't watch this. Couldn't listen to them talk about that day, about her, about how she'd become a cautionary tale in the airline industry. Standing abruptly, she dumped the remains of her lunch in the trash and hurried out of the break room, ignoring the whispers that followed her. Mr. Martinez was waiting when she returned to her cart. "Change of assignment," he said, checking his clipboard. "VIP lounge needs attention. Regular cleaner called in sick." Karen's throat went dry. The VIP lounge, where she used to serve champagne and make small talk with executives, where she used to belong. Could I maybe—" She started to protest, but Mr. Martinez was already walking away. She had no choice. Pushing her cart toward the exclusive section of the terminal, Karen felt every step growing heavier. The VIP lounge entrance loomed ahead, its frosted glass doors and elegant signage a reminder of everything she'd lost. She remembered walking through those doors countless times in her crisp uniform, head held high. Now she entered through the service entrance, keeping her eyes down as she began her cleaning routine. The lounge was relatively empty, a blessing, she thought. Just a few business travelers absorbed in their laptops or phones. She worked methodically, trying to be as invisible as possible, dusting the side tables, emptying small trash bins, wiping down the coffee station. Finally, she began mopping near the main entrance, saving the worst task for last. The automatic doors would keep opening as passengers came and went, making it hard to keep the floor clean. The doors slid open with a soft whoosh. Karen looked up automatically and felt her entire body go cold. Darnell Brooks stood in the doorway, his presence commanding the space just as it had that day on the plane. He wore an impeccably tailored suit, his expression calm and controlled. And beside him, Jamal walked in, laughing at something his father had just said. He looked different than he had 6 months ago, taller maybe, more confident if that was possible. He wore expensive casual clothes and carried a tablet under his arm. He was talking animatedly about something, completely at ease in this environment that was rightfully his. Karen stood frozen, her hands locked around the mop handle. She wanted to run, to hide, to dissolve into the floor she'd been cleaning, but her feet wouldn't move. Jamal's laughter faded as his eyes swept the lounge and then landed on her. For a moment, he didn't seem to recognize her. His expression remained light, casual. Then understanding dawned in his eyes, and his smile slipped away. They stared at each other across the polished floor, Karen in her baggy gray uniform clutching her mop like a shield, Jamal in his expensive clothes, standing tall beside his powerful father. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Karen felt herself shrinking under his gaze. She wanted to say something, to apologize, to explain, to beg forgiveness. But no words came. What could she possibly say to this child whose innocence she had tried to steal? This boy she had humiliated and assaulted because of her own prejudice? The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken words. Karen's hands trembled on the mop handle. Sweat beaded on her forehead under the bright lounge lights. But Jamal said nothing. Just like that day on the plane when she was being escorted off, he simply watched her. His expression wasn't angry or satisfied or vindictive. He just saw her, really saw her, in all her fallen glory. Then, as if she were nothing more than a piece of furniture, he turned back to his father and continued their conversation. They walked past her toward the premium seating area, their shoes leaving marks on her freshly mopped floor. Karen stood rooted to the spot, still gripping the mop, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. She was invisible again, but not in the way she usually was now. This was different. To them, she wasn't even worth acknowledging. She was less than nobody. And somehow that hurt more than all the stares and whispers and rejections combined. Because 6 months ago, she had thought she had the power to judge who belonged in first class. She had thought she had the right to put people in their place. Now she knew exactly where she belonged, and it was right here, cleaning up after people who didn't even see her anymore. Karen's life had settled into a monotonous routine of cleaning floors, avoiding eye contact, and returning to her sister's house each night. The guest room felt smaller with each passing day, its walls closing in like a prison cell. Rachel barely spoke to her anymore, their interactions limited to brief nods in the hallway or the occasional "excuse me" when they crossed paths in the kitchen. The work at the airport was physically demanding, leaving Karen's muscles aching each night. But the emotional toll was far worse. Every day she watched flight attendants stride past in their crisp uniforms, their heads held high, their careers soaring. She remembered when that was her life, when she commanded respect, when she belonged in the sky. Now she belonged to the ground, to the endless cycle of mopping and scrubbing and hiding from familiar faces. The isolation had become almost complete. Even her fellow custodial workers kept their distance, whether from knowing her story or sensing her bitterness. One Tuesday morning, Karen sat on the edge of her bed, dreading another day of work. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, probably another spam call, she thought. She almost didn't answer it. But something made her reach for the device. Maybe desperation. Maybe the tiny spark of hope that refused to die completely. "Hello?" Her voice was rough from disuse. "Is this Karen Whitmore?" The voice on the other end was professional, cheerful. "I'm calling from Apex Customer Solutions. We received your application and would like to schedule an interview." Karen's hand tightened around the phone, her heart began to race. "An interview?" "Yes, for our customer service representative position. Would you be available tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.? Karen could barely breathe. Was this really happening? After months of rejection, after countless applications sent into the void, Someone actually wanted to interview her? Yes, she said quickly, afraid the offer might disappear if she hesitated. Yes, I'm available. She wrote down the address with shaking hands. A corporate office in Manhattan, a real job, a chance to escape the airport floors and whispered comments. That night, Karen couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, imagining a new life. One where she could afford her own apartment again, where she could rebuild her dignity, piece by piece. She got up early the next morning, taking extra care with her appearance. Her best clothes were long gone, sold to pay bills, but she had managed to find a decent black blazer at a thrift store. It was slightly too big, but she hoped it wouldn't be noticeable. Karen spent nearly an hour on her makeup, trying to cover the dark circles under her eyes, the stress lines that had deepened over the past months. Her hands trembled slightly as she applied mascara. The mirror showed a woman she barely recognized anymore. Gone was the confident senior flight attendant who could silence a cabin with a look. In her place stood someone diminished. But today, maybe that could start to change. The corporate building loomed ahead as Karen approached, its glass facade reflecting the morning sun. She checked the time, 15 minutes early. Perfect. Taking a deep breath, she pushed through the revolving doors into the sleek lobby. The security guard barely glanced at her as she signed in. The receptionist was polite but distant, directing her to take the elevator to the 14th floor. Karen's heels clicked against the polished floor as she followed the signs to the interview room. Each step felt like progress, like moving toward something better. Hope fluttered in her chest, fragile but persistent. The interview room was modern and minimalist, a single table, 2 chairs, and a wall of windows overlooking the city. Karen sat in one of the chairs, smoothing her blazer, checking her reflection one last time in her phone screen. Minutes ticked by. Karen's palms grew sweaty. She wiped them on her skirt, trying to stay calm. This was just an interview. She'd done hundreds of interviews before, from the other side of the table, but still, she knew how this worked. The door handle turned. Karen straightened in her chair, preparing her most professional smile. She had rehearsed her answers all night. She was ready. The door opened. A man in a sharp navy suit stepped into the room. Karen's smile froze on her face. Time seemed to stop. The air grew thick, heavy, impossible to breathe. Karen's heart, which had been racing with nervous excitement, stuttered to a halt. Darnell Brooks stood in the doorway, his presence filling the room just as it had that day on the plane. His expression was unreadable, his posture relaxed, but commanding. Karen couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't process what was happening. Her mind refused to accept the reality before her. With deliberate calm, Darnell closed the door behind him. His footsteps were measured as he crossed to the table. The chair made no sound as he pulled it back and settled into it, directly across from Karen. He folded his hands on the table, his movements precise and controlled. His eyes, those same eyes that had frozen her in place 6 months ago, met hers. "Miss Whitmore," he said, his voice steady and professional. "Thank you for coming in." The silence that followed was absolute. Karen felt her entire body go cold, as if ice water had replaced her blood. She couldn't even tremble anymore. She was completely frozen, trapped in this moment, facing the man whose son she had assaulted, whose airline she had disgraced, whose power she had severely underestimated. Karen sat frozen in the interview room, her fingers digging into her thighs beneath the table. The crisp navy suit across from her seemed to mock everything she'd lost. Darnell Brooks studied her with the same calculating patience he'd shown that day on the plane, the day her life had shattered. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Karen's throat felt dry, her carefully prepared interview responses crumbling to dust in her mind. The morning's hope seemed like a cruel joke now. Of course this wasn't a real interview. Of course he was behind this. She should have known the moment she saw the company letterhead. "Miss Whitmore." His voice carried the same smooth authority it had held at 30,000 feet. "Tell me, why do you think you're here?" Karen's hands trembled in her lap. She tried to steady them, to project some semblance of the confidence she'd once worn like armor. But that armor had been stripped away months ago, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. 6 rejections in 2 weeks, rent due, savings dwindling to nothing. The question hung in the air between them. Why was she here? The obvious answer, because she needed a job, any job, felt hollow in the face of his steady gaze. She could feel the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on her shoulders, crushing her former pride into dust. Her voice cracked. She cleared her throat, trying again. I'm here because I'm qualified for the position. I have extensive experience in customer service and… Do you? Darnell's interruption was soft but devastating. Your most recent customer service interaction involved assaulting a child. Karen flinched as if he'd slapped her. She could feel sweat beading at the back of her neck, dampening the collar of her thrift store blazer. The room suddenly felt too small, too warm. She struggled to maintain eye contact with the man who had systematically dismantled her entire life without ever raising his voice. I've learned… The words tumbled out, weak and unconvincing. She took a deep breath, trying to gather herself. I need a second chance. A second chance? Darnell leaned back in his chair, the subtle movement somehow making him seem even more imposing. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes held an intensity that made Karen want to shrink into herself. The gold cufflinks at his wrists caught the light as he folded his hands. And tell me, he continued, each word measured and precise, did you give my son a first one? The question hit Karen like a physical blow. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her mind flashed back to that moment, seeing Jamal sitting in first class, the immediate suspicion that had clouded her judgment, the absolute certainty she'd felt about his guilt. She hadn't given him a chance, not even close. She'd seen his skin color and made up her mind. Darnell watched her internal struggle without comment. His silence was more effective than any accusation could have been. It forced Karen to sit with the truth of what she'd done, what she'd assumed, what she'd believed without a shred of evidence. The weight of it pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe. You didn't just assault a child that day, Miss Whitmore, he said finally, his voice still eerily calm. You made a decision. You saw a black boy in first class, and you decided he was a thief. Each word landed like a hammer blow, methodically dismantling any defense she might have tried to construct. The truth of it burned in her chest. She had made that decision, hadn't she? Before any wallet went missing, before any accusation was made, she'd looked at Jamal and decided he didn't belong. She'd never once considered he might be exactly where he was supposed to be. And now, Darnell continued, his gaze never wavering, you want me to decide you deserve a job? Karen felt like she was suffocating. The room seemed to spin slightly around her. She opened her mouth to argue, to defend herself, to say anything that might salvage this situation. But what could she possibly say? What words could justify what she'd done? The realization settled over her like a heavy blanket. Darnell stood up, his movement smooth and deliberate. He straightened his jacket with practiced ease, looking down at Karen with an expression that held neither anger nor satisfaction, just cold finality. He didn't need to shout or threaten, his power was in his composure. I don't hire racists. The words fell like a judge's gavel, final and absolute. Karen sat there, stunned, as Darnell walked out without looking back. The soft click of the door closing behind him echoed in the silent room. She knew with crushing certainty that this was permanent. There would be no appeal, no reconsideration. She had finally met the consequences of her actions. Karen sat in her car, staring blankly at the dashboard. The afternoon sun beat down through the windshield, but she didn't move to turn on the air conditioning. The heat felt appropriate somehow, suffocating, uncomfortable, inescapable. Just like her new reality. Her hands still trembled slightly as they rested in her lap. The interview, if she could even call it that, kept replaying in her mind. Darnell Brooks's calm, measured voice, his penetrating stare, the way he had systematically stripped away any pretense she might have held about her situation. She hadn't really expected to get the job, had she? Deep down, she must have known. The way the receptionist had smiled too kindly, the empty interview room, the perfect timing of his entrance. It had all been orchestrated. Another reminder of her permanent fall from grace. The parking lot around her slowly emptied as other job candidates left, their faces bright with hope or disappointment from actual interviews. Real chances at real jobs. Karen watched them through her windshield, feeling disconnected from their reality. They lived in a world where mistakes could be fixed, where second chances existed. Her world had shrunk to this, sitting in a second-hand car, wearing a thrift store blazer, pretending she still had a shot at redemption. Her phone buzzed in her purse, startling her from her daze. Probably Rachel, checking to see how the interview went. Karen couldn't bear to answer, couldn't face telling her sister about this latest humiliation. Instead, she pulled out her phone and mindlessly scrolled through social media, trying to distract herself. A notification popped up at the top of her screen. Breaking news. Jamal Brooks speaks out. A powerful message on racism in America. Karen's thumb hovered over the alert. She knew she should ignore it, knew nothing good could come from watching. But like picking at a scab, she couldn't help herself. The video opened to a packed auditorium. Jamal stood at a podium, looking poised and confident in a perfectly tailored suit. He'd grown taller since that day on the plane, Karen noticed. His face had lost some of its childhood softness, but his eyes still held that same steady gaze, the one that had unnerved her so much that day. People always say racism is just words, Jamal began, his voice clear and strong. The audience fell silent, hanging on every syllable. But I know it can be a slap, a hand gripping your wrist, a decision made before you even open your mouth. Karen's stomach lurched. She watched as the camera panned across the audience, catching their reactions, nodding heads, tears, fierce expressions of agreement. These people didn't see her side, would never understand how things had spiraled so quickly that day. They just saw what they wanted to see, a racist woman attacking an innocent child. The camera shifted to where Darnell sat in the front row, radiating quiet authority in his signature navy suit. He stood up when Jamal finished speaking, joining his son at the podium. The applause was deafening. "My son," Darnell said, placing a protective hand on Jamal's shoulder, "shouldn't have to be brave. He shouldn't have to be composed in the face of hatred. But he was, and he is. And I make sure no one like that ever works in my company again." More applause. More nodding heads. More tears. Karen's vision began to tunnel, the edges of her world going dark. She gripped her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. The words echoed in her head. No one like that. That's what she was now. A cautionary tale. Example of what not to be. A permanent outcast. The realization hit her with physical force, making her gasp for air in the stuffy car. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a rough patch that would eventually smooth over. This was her life now. Permanently altered. Permanently diminished. She would never again walk confidently through an airport in a crisp uniform. Never feel the satisfaction of closing an overhead compartment with authority. Never command respect with a simple gesture or word. The corporate world, with its sleek offices and professional courtesy, was closed to her forever. Even basic customer service jobs would be out of reach. Who would trust their brand to the woman who had become the face of workplace racism? Her hands shook as she tried to turn off the phone, but another notification popped up, then another. The interview was trending. Jamal Speaks was gaining momentum. Her name was being dragged through the mud again, a fresh wave of public shame washing over her. Karen stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed older, diminished. Her carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the dark circles under her eyes or the defeated slump of her shoulders. This was who she was now. A cautionary tale, a viral video, a permanent example of consequences. The reality of her situation pressed down on her like a physical weight. She would spend the rest of her life cleaning floors or stocking shelves or whatever menial work she could find. Always looking over her shoulder, always waiting to be recognized, always knowing that one viral moment had defined her entire existence. She watched as another group of interview candidates walked past her car, their heels clicking confidently on the pavement, their futures still bright with possibility. Karen slumped lower in her seat, not wanting to be seen. This parking lot with its view of gleaming corporate offices didn't belong to her anymore. None of it did. Her phone buzzed again, Rachel calling now. Karen let it ring. What could she say? How could she explain that she had finally understood the true scope of her fall? That she had finally realized there was no climbing back up, no redemption arc, no second act in her story. The sun continued to beat down through the windshield, but Karen didn't move. She sat there, letting the heat press against her skin, watching as the professional world carried on without her. She had become a ghost in her own life, forever haunting the edges of a world she could no longer enter. Karen stood in the dingy staff room of Airport Maintenance Services, clutching her new uniform to her chest. The scratchy polyester felt foreign against her skin, a far cry from the crisp, professional attire she'd worn for 15 years as a flight attendant. The name tag simply read Karen. No title, no airline logo, just her first name printed in plain black letters. She ran her thumb over it, remembering how her previous badge had proudly displayed Senior Flight Attendant in gleaming gold lettering. Her supervisor, a weathered man named Dave, barely looked up from his clipboard as he handed her a schedule. You'll start in Terminal B. Bathrooms need cleaning every 2 hours. Supply closets down the hall. Don't forget to log your cleaning times. His voice was flat, uninterested in her or her circumstances. Karen nodded mechanically, her throat too tight to speak. She changed in the small employee bathroom, avoiding her reflection in the spotted mirror. The uniform hung loose in all the wrong places, the industrial gray making her skin look sallow and sickly. She tugged at the shapeless garment, trying to make it look somewhat presentable, but it was hopeless. When she emerged pushing her first cleaning cart, the weight of her new reality pressed down on her shoulders. The same terminals she'd strode through confidently just months ago now stretched before her like an endless gauntlet. The gleaming floors she'd clicked across in heels would now be the floors she mopped. Every corner of this airport held memories of her former life, now taunting her with what she'd lost. The morning rush was in full swing. Business travelers hurried past with their rolling suitcases, flight crews walked in formation, their uniforms immaculate. Karen kept her head down, focusing on the squeak of her cart's wheels. Still, she couldn't help noticing how people moved around her without seeing her, like she was just another piece of airport furniture. Occasionally, someone would bump into her cart without even a mumbled apology. She reached her first bathroom assignment. The women's restroom in Terminal B was busy with travelers touching up makeup and fixing hair before flights. Karen waited awkwardly with her cart until it cleared out enough for her to work. Her hands trembled as she pulled on rubber gloves. The bright yellow color seemed to scream about her fall from grace. The work itself was mindless but exhausting. Scrubbing toilets, wiping mirrors, mopping floors, over and over, bathroom after bathroom. Her back ached from bending, and the chemical smell of cleaning products made her head swim. But worst of all was the constant parade of people treating her like she was invisible. Women would walk right past her, dropping paper towels on the floor she'd just mopped as if she didn't exist. Around mid-morning, she was restocking paper towels when she heard familiar voices approaching. A group of flight attendants from her old airline walked in, laughing about something. Karen quickly turned away, but it was too late. "Oh my God," one of them whispered. "Is that the racist flight attendant?" Another answered. "The one who hit that CEO's kid? Look at her now, cleaning toilets." They didn't bother lowering their voices. Karen's face burned as she pretended to be very focused on aligning the paper towels perfectly. The flight attendants took their time at the mirrors, throwing glances her way and whispering behind their hands. She recognized two of them, women she'd trained years ago. When they finally left, one of them said loudly, "Karma's a bitch, isn't it?" Karen gripped the paper towel dispenser until her knuckles turned white. She deserved this. She knew she deserved this, but knowing didn't make it hurt any less. The bathroom suddenly felt suffocating, the walls closing in around her shame. The day dragged on. Every hour brought new humiliations. A passenger complained about her cart being in the way. A child pointed and asked his mother why the cleaning lady was crying. A former colleague walked right past her without a glance, though Karen knew she'd been recognized by the slight smirk on the woman's face. Each interaction was another small cut to what remained of her dignity. By afternoon, Karen's legs were shaking from exhaustion. She'd never done such physical work before. Her neat bun had come loose, wisps of hair sticking to her sweaty face. She was scrubbing at a stubborn stain in one of the sinks when she heard voices in the terminal outside, voices that made her blood run cold. Looking up at the bathroom mirror, she saw them through the doorway. Darnell Brooks, commanding attention in his perfectly tailored suit, walking with purpose through the terminal. Beside him was Jamal, taller now than in her memories, carrying himself with the same quiet confidence as his father. They moved through the crowd effortlessly, people instinctively making way for them. Karen's hand stilled on the sink. For a moment, she was back on that flight, raising her hand to a child's face, making the worst mistake of her life. She watched in the mirror as they passed the bathroom entrance, neither one glancing her way. Jamal was talking animatedly about something, gesturing with his hands while his father listened with obvious pride. They had no reason to look. She was just another maintenance worker, another anonymous figure in gray pushing a mop through their airport. The contrast between their trajectories couldn't have been clearer. They soared higher every day while she scrubbed the ground they walked on. They had risen above the incident that had defined and destroyed her. Karen stared at herself in the mirror long after they'd passed. Her face was flushed, her hair frizzy, her uniform already stained with cleaning products. This was who she was now. This was all she would ever be. The woman who had once prided herself on her authority was now invisible to the very people she'd tried to control. The sink she'd been cleaning dripped steadily, echoing in the quiet bathroom. Karen picked up her sponge and got back to work. She had 6 more bathrooms to clean before her shift ended, and the afternoon rush would be starting soon. The weight of her new life settled over her like a shroud as she pushed her cart toward the next restroom. Sometime later, Karen stood in the employee restroom. Her hands braced against the sink as she stared at her reflection in the scratched mirror. The harsh fluorescent lighting did her no favors, highlighting every line of exhaustion etched into her face. Her gray maintenance uniform hung loose and shapeless, already sporting several bleach stains from her morning's work. The rubber gloves she wore were stained and worn, a far cry from the pristine white gloves she'd once worn as a flight attendant. She barely recognized the woman looking back at her. Gone was the perfectly coiffed hair, replaced by limp strands escaping from a messy ponytail. The confident posture had vanished, leaving behind slumped shoulders and a perpetual downward gaze. Even her eyes seemed different, duller, haunted by the weight of her actions and their consequences. The door creaked open and another maintenance worker walked in. The woman gave Karen a brief, disinterested glance before heading to a stall. That was how people looked at her now, when they bothered to look at all. She was part of the background, as invisible as the trash cans and cleaning supplies she managed. Karen pulled her gloves back on with a snap that echoed in the small space. Her break was over. Time to return to her endless cycle of cleaning bathrooms and mopping floors. She wheeled her cart out into the bustling terminal, keeping close to the walls as travelers rushed past with their rolling suitcases and carry-ons. As she approached her next assignment, the sound of applause drew her attention. A small crowd had gathered around one of the TV screens in the airport lounge. Karen's hands tightened on her cart handle as she recognized the figure on the screen. Jamal Brooks stood at a podium, poised and confident in a perfectly tailored suit. The caption below identified the event as the National Aviation Safety Conference. The audience was giving him a standing ovation, their faces bright with admiration. Even through the TV screen, his presence commanded attention. At just 14 years old, Jamal Brooks has become the youngest recipient of the Aviation Innovation Award, the news anchor's voice announced. His work in developing new safety protocols and advocating for racial equality in air travel has already made significant impacts in the industry. Karen found herself frozen in place, unable to look away from the screen. Jamal's voice filled the terminal as he began his acceptance speech. 3 years ago, I experienced firsthand how discrimination can make air travel unsafe for young people of color, he said, his voice steady and clear. That experience showed me that change wasn't just necessary, it was urgent. Today, I'm proud to say that our new training programs have been implemented in 12 major airlines, helping ensure that no child feels threatened or unwelcome in the skies. The crowd erupted in another round of applause. Karen's stomach churned as she watched Darnell Brooks join his son on stage, both of them beaming with pride. The camera panned across the audience, showing rows of airline executives and industry leaders nodding in approval. Young Mr. Brooks has also launched a scholarship program, the anchor continued, helping minority students pursue careers in aviation and aerospace engineering. His father, airline CEO Darnell Brooks, has called his son's achievements just the beginning of a remarkable journey. Karen turned away, her hands shaking as she gripped her cleaning cart. The boy she had tried to humiliate was soaring beyond anything she could have imagined. While she scrubbed toilets and mopped floors, he was changing the entire industry. Her attempt to put him in his place had only propelled him higher. She hurried into the nearest bathroom, desperate to escape the sound of Jamal's voice. But even as she mechanically wiped down counters and replaced paper towels, his words echoed in her head. He had taken what she'd done to him and turned it into fuel for change. He had transformed his pain into purpose. The hours crawled by until finally, mercifully, it was time to clock out. Karen changed back into her street clothes in the cramped employee locker room, stuffing her stained uniform into her bag. Her muscles ached from the day's labor, but the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the weight in her chest. She walked through the employee exit into the cold evening air. The sound of jets taking off thundered overhead, a constant reminder of the world she'd lost. Around her, airport workers streamed out of various doors: mechanics, baggage handlers, security staff. Many of them were heading to their cars, chatting about plans for the evening or the next day's schedule. Karen walked to the bus stop. Her car had been repossessed months ago, another piece of her former life stripped away. As she stood waiting in the gathering darkness, the reality of her situation pressed down on her like a physical weight. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't a setback she could overcome with time and effort. This was permanent. She watched as a plane climbed into the darkening sky, its lights blinking against the purple dusk. Somewhere up there, people like her former self were serving drinks in first class. Somewhere up there, people like Jamal Brooks were changing the world. But down here on the ground, Karen Whitmore would remain. Trapped. Forever. Cleaning up after others and trying to fade into the background of a world that had moved on without her. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes. As Karen climbed aboard, she caught her reflection one last time in the bus's dark window. The woman looking back at her was a ghost of her former self, and that ghost would haunt these terminals for the rest of her working days, while Jamal Brooks soared ever higher, beyond her reach, beyond her power to harm, beyond anything she had ever achieved in her years of looking down on others. Karen sat alone in the dim light of her sister's basement apartment, the harsh glow of her laptop screen casting shadows on her gaunt face. The small space felt more like a prison cell than a home. Bare walls, a lumpy second-hand mattress on the floor, and a mini fridge that hummed emptily in the corner. The sound of footsteps above reminded her that her sister's family lived their normal lives upstairs, while she existed down here hidden away like a shameful secret. She clicked through job listings mechanically, her eyes glazing over as she scrolled past positions she knew would reject her. Administrative assistant, customer service representative, retail manager. Each one represented another closed door, another dead end. Her mouse hovered over the apply buttons, but she couldn't bring herself to click. What was the point? Her name was poison now. The mini fridge contained only a half-empty bottle of water and some nearly expired yogurt. Karen's stomach growled, but she ignored it. Opening her banking app, she stared at the balance. $8.47. Not even enough for a decent meal. Her credit cards were maxed out, her savings depleted. She had officially hit rock bottom. The basement's small window well let in a patch of gray afternoon light, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Outside, life went on. People worked, earned money, built futures. But in here, time seemed frozen. Karen was trapped in an endless loop of rejection and regret. She minimized the job search tabs and opened Google, Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard before slowly typing, "Karen Whitmore, flight attendant." The search results loaded instantly, a digital wall of shame. At the very top, dominating the screen, was the video. That video. The thumbnail showed her face twisted in anger, her hand raised mid-slap. The view count had reached millions. The comments section was a graveyard of her reputation, filled with angry faces and hateful words that pierced her heart every time she looked. Below the video, news articles spread across the page like accusations. Former flight attendant Karen Whitmore, permanently blacklisted from airline industry. Racist attack at 30,000 feet, the fall of Karen Whitmore. Airlines unite against discrimination, industry-wide ban on disgraced flight attendant. Each headline felt like another nail in the coffin of her former life. But it was the third result that made her breath catch in her throat. A glossy magazine cover filled her screen, featuring a confident young man in an aviation cadet uniform. Jamal Brooks smiled at the camera, standing tall against a backdrop of blue sky and jet engines. The headline blazed across the image. Jamal Brooks, the boy who rose above hate. Karen clicked the article, her hands shaking slightly. The words seemed to mock her from the screen. Jamal had just received a full scholarship to one of the country's top aerospace engineering programs. At 16, he was already developing safety protocols that were being adopted by major airlines. His foundation for minority youth in aviation had raised millions in funding. The article quoted him directly. "That moment of discrimination could have grounded me, but instead, it gave me wings. It showed me exactly what needed to change in the industry, and it gave me the determination to be that change." A bitter laugh escaped Karen's throat, echoing in the empty basement. The sound was hollow, devoid of humor. The boy she had tried to humiliate had transformed her attack into a launching pad for success. Her attempt to tear him down had only pushed him higher. The article went on to detail Jamal's achievements: speaking engagements, industry awards, mentorship programs. He had taken what she did to him and turned it into a movement. While she sat in this basement, broke and forgotten, he was soaring. His future stretched out bright and limitless before him, while hers had contracted to this small, dark space. Karen scrolled through more search results, each one hammering home the reality of her situation. Her name would forever be associated with that moment of hatred. She was a cautionary tale, an example used in corporate training sessions about what not to do. Her entire identity had been reduced to those few seconds of footage that played over and over in the minds of everyone who had seen it. The laptop screen blurred as tears filled her eyes. She slammed it shut, plunging the basement into deeper darkness. The walls seemed to close in around her, blank and accusatory. In the silence, broken only by the humming mini-fridge and the muffled sounds of life above, Karen finally faced the truth she had been running from. "I ruined my life," she whispered to the empty room. The words hung in the air, heavy with finality. There was no one else to blame, no conspiracy against her, no misunderstanding to clear up. She had done this to herself. One moment of unchecked prejudice, one action born from years of unexamined bias, and she had destroyed everything she had worked for. It was too late to fix it. Too late to apologize, too late to make amends, too late to rebuild. The world had moved on, leaving her behind in this basement, with nothing but regret and $8.47 to her name. She pulled her knees to her chest and sat in the darkness, a forgotten woman paying the price for a moment that would define her forever. Months slipped by like shadows across the airport terminal floors. Karen's story, once a viral sensation that had ignited fierce debates and endless social media threads, gradually faded from public consciousness. No more news articles dissected her downfall. No more trending videos captured her shame. The world had simply moved on, leaving her behind like yesterday's headlines. She existed now in the margins of airport life, a gray uniformed figure pushing a mop through endless corridors. Most passengers looked right through her, their eyes sliding past as if she were part of the architecture. Even the flight attendants who had once whispered and pointed rarely bothered anymore. She had become truly invisible. The cleaning cart's squeaky wheel echoed through Terminal B as Karen worked her way down the glossy floors. Her movements were mechanical now, practiced from months of repetition. Back and forth, back and forth. The mop traced patterns across the linoleum like a metronome marking time. The same floors she had once strutted across in heels now felt the shuffle of her practical work shoes. Morning light streamed through the terminal's massive windows, catching the metal surfaces of check-in counters and luggage carts. Karen kept her head down, focusing on the rhythmic motion of cleaning. It was easier that way. Easier than looking up at the faces of passengers rushing to their destinations, living the life she once had. The airport's PA system crackled to life, its familiar tone cutting through the ambient noise of rolling suitcases and murmured conversations. Karen's hand stilled on the mop handle as the announcement began. Now boarding Flight 482 to Los Angeles. The words hit her like a physical blow. Flight 482, the same flight number, the same destination, the flight that had changed everything. Her fingers tightened around the wooden handle until her knuckles turned white. She could feel the smooth grain of the wood pressing into her palms, anchoring her to the present even as memories threatened to overwhelm her. The sound of her own voice from that day echoed in her head, sharp with accusation. The feeling of her hand striking soft skin, the gasps of passengers, the cold fury in Darnell Brooks's eyes. A stream of passengers flowed past her toward the gate, their carry-ons wheeling across her freshly mopped floor. Karen kept her head down, but her eyes tracked their movements. Business travelers in press suits, elderly couples holding hands, college students with backpacks, the same types of people she used to serve, now barely registering her existence. Then she saw him. Jamal Brooks walked with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in an airport terminal. He'd grown taller, his features sharpening into those of a young man, but Karen would have recognized him anywhere. He wore a crisp aviation student's uniform, a leather messenger bag slung across his shoulder. A stack of technical manuals peeked out from the top. Karen's breath caught in her throat. The last time she'd seen him in person, he'd been that little boy in first class, clutching his comic book. Now he moved with purpose, his head held high, his future stretching out before him like the runway lights at dawn. Other passengers seemed to recognize him. A few nodded respectfully. A young black girl pointed and whispered excitedly to her mother. Jamal smiled and waved at them, comfortable in the spotlight that had once been Karen's domain. He passed within feet of where she stood, close enough that she could see the Aviation Academy insignia on his uniform, the professional shine of his shoes, the determination in his stride. Karen found herself holding her breath, frozen in place with her mop suspended above the floor. But Jamal's eyes never turned her way. He continued toward the gate, absorbed in conversation with a fellow student walking beside him. They were discussing flight patterns and engine specifications, their voices animated with enthusiasm for their chosen field. Karen watched as he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent, who smiled warmly and wished him a good flight. He disappeared down the jet bridge without ever having noticed the woman with the mop, the woman who had once tried to destroy him, because she didn't matter anymore, not to him, not to anyone. The boarding call continued as more passengers filed past. Karen forced herself to resume mopping, her movements mechanical once again. Through the massive windows, she could see Flight 482 waiting at the gate, the same type of aircraft she had once called her office, the same route she had flown countless times. She watched as the ground crew completed their preparations, watched as the jet bridge slowly retracted, watched as the massive engines spun to life. The plane began to taxi, its wings gleaming in the morning sun. Karen's hands gripped the mop handle tighter as the aircraft turned onto the runway. With a roar of engines, it gathered speed, lifting gracefully into the sky, taking Jamal Brooks to new heights, leaving Karen Whitmore behind. She turned back to her cleaning supplies, the mop bucket's wheels squeaking against the floor as she pushed it forward. Her practical shoes made soft sounds on the linoleum as she resumed her endless task. Around her, the airport continued its constant rhythm of arrivals and departures. But Karen remained fixed in place, grounded. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the air conditioning hummed, and she kept mopping. Forever trapped in the consequences of a single moment of hatred, while others soared far above her head, touching the sky she would never reach again. If you enjoyed the story of Darnell and Jamal, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.